So copying of the New Testament. So, is this a topic of great interest to anybody? How would you know if it's a topic of great interest in today's era? You look at the movies and you look at the book selling list. So in 2013, a fellow called Reza Aslan wrote a book called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, Reza Aslan, where have you heard the name Aslan before? Narnia. We're really getting into the arts this talk, aren't we? Lots of talk about movies and now Narnia. So Aslan. Now Reza Aslan is not a Christian. He states that he was once. He's a Muslim. And he wrote this book purporting that, this is a fairly direct quote as well, the Gospels are not, nor were they ever intended to be, historical documentation of Jesus' life. So he's saying, you know, well, you wouldn't want to read the Gospels because they were never meant to have actually told you anything about the historicity, the reality, what really happened in real time and real place with Jesus. That's what he's saying, isn't he? Now, that was a #1 New York Times bestseller in 2013. So what we're talking about today isn't just something that a few Christians of an older generation are interested in. This is stuff that makes New York Times best-selling books. In 2005, a fellow called Bart Ehrman, not Bert, Bart Ehrman wrote a book, and he called it, in very non-subtle ways, Misquoting Jesus, the story of who changed the Bible and why. Not, I think the Bible was changed, and this is how I think it happened, but he just wrote it, put it right out there. Misquoting Jesus, the story of who changed the Bible and why. In the first 3 months, he sold 100,000 copies. So that was 2005. So it's a pretty popular topic. And in 2003, what was the #1 best-selling book in 2003 that said that it's just a waste of time reading the New Testament? The Da Vinci Code, yes, exactly. The Da Vinci Code in 6 years sold 80 million copies. It was translated into 44 languages. So that's gobsmacking, isn't it? And its overriding message is that this New Testament is a fabrication. Don't bother with it. It's been so heavily edited. So against that, what does the evidence say? That's what is always the matter, isn't it? That's always what's important. It's not so much what my opinion is, but what my opinion is based on. And that's why I wrote that book, Echoes of Jesus. I hope you'll buy a copy tonight. Jodie's got a little machine so she can do it with the credit card facilities, etc. And it's written in a very friendly way. It presents all the evidence. There's lots of references there. It doesn't assume that the reader knows anything about Jesus or Christianity or knows anything about history or Greek language, but it does present a really nice, clear picture of what the evidence is. So what is the evidence? Well, here's a question for you. Who could find something they wrote in their house that's 30 years old? Put your hand up. A few. Who could find something in their house that their grandparents wrote? Wow. Amazing. Okay. Yeah. So, but if you go back a further generation or two, it's starting to get harder, isn't it? How old do you think our oldest complete copy is of the New Testament in its original language? The original language of the New Testament was Greek. How old? What year would have it been written if we still got it around today, a complete copy? 200 AD, not quite that young. 400, not quite that old. So around 350 AD, and it's called Codex Sinaiticus. A fellow called von Tischendorf discovered the New Testament part of it in 1859. And it's a complete copy of the New Testament in Greek. Pretty amazing, isn't it? So we can go all the way back to see what a handwritten copy of the New Testament looked like way before the printing press, and we can compare it with our more modern copies since then. We can compare copy from 350 AD with more modern copies, couldn't we? But David was, now there's other very big copies. So there's one called Codex Vaticanus, and a lot of people might have heard of that. It's obviously kept in the Vatican, that's why it's called Codex Vaticanus. Codex is just a fancy word for book. And it goes back to about 325 AD, but it's missing 1 and 2 Timothy, it's missing Titus, Philippians and Revelations, and some of Hebrew. But once again, it's a big portion. So once again, we can compare one older copy with another less old copy. And then David was right. We actually have fairly big bits of the New Testament going back to 200 AD. And we've even got a small bit that goes back to about 125 AD, P52. So that enables us to do a lot of comparisons. And I've made it really easy for you by putting it into a very readable section in my book. So what do we find? Well, one guy called Professor Fee, he looked at the changes in Luke chapter 10 that were between a portion of an Old Testament, a New Testament copy that was written about AD 175. It's called P75. That's the way they named old piece of document. So it was written about 175 AD. It's called P75. And you compared what was written in it with Codex Vaticanus, which was written about 325 AD. Now, we know that they're not direct copies of each other. But he wanted to see, well, how well has the copying been done, given that there must have been at least one, if not many, copies between the two. And what he did is he looked at Luke chapter 10. So there's about 980 words. And it's an important chapter because about 75% of the words are from Jesus. So if you want to see how good people were at copying Jesus' words, it's a good chapter to look at, isn't it? Because 75% of the words are Jesus' words. So he found that there was only 12 changes. Of those 12 changes, only 6 were to do with Jesus' words. And all of them are inconsequential. So in Luke 10 verse 18, it talks about Satan falling out of heaven like lightning. The other one talks about Satan as lightning falling out of heaven. If you didn't catch the difference, that's because there's not much difference there. So they're very similar. Now, some of the copyists weren't as sticklers for every letter of every word as other copyists. So some copyists made deliberate changes. And this is the stuff that gets quoted on the internet. They say, well, there's this great guy, this great scholar of Greek, and he says when he compares two ancient copies of the New Testament, he can see that there's been deliberate changes made. And of course, you can imagine how that gets spread on the atheist websites, the Islamic websites. What does he mean by the deliberate changes? What are the deliberate changes? Well, there's an old piece of the New Testament called P45. It was written about 250 AD. When we look at what that guy did, yes, he made deliberate changes. So he was a guy who got rid of redundancies. So if I said that Barry's wearing a grey shirt, a grey coloured shirt, there's a redundancy in there, isn't there? I didn't need to say the word colour. If I say Barry is wearing a grey shirt, it is obviously a grey coloured shirt. If in Mark 6 verse 38 it says that Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and then in Mark 6 verse 41 it talks about the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, this guy who did the copying of P45, he regarded that as a redundancy. So he would get rid of just the 5 and the 2. Because he thought, well, why do I need to repeat 5 loaves and 2 fishes just 2 sentences down? Why don't I just say loaves and fishes? Yes, he made a deliberate change. Was any significant information lost? No, and we can see a pattern. So my book talks about that the deliberate changes and the unintentional changes are inconsequential. And so you can feel quite rest assured when you're reading the words of the New Testament that you're reading the words that Jesus actually said, faithfully recorded. So what did Jesus say? He said a lot of things, didn't he? One of the things he says in Luke chapter 22 verse 37 is he quotes from Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is an Old Testament book written 750 BC. We've actually got a copy of Isaiah written about 100 BC. And we know that it's been copied faithfully over time. Jesus is suddenly quoting from this book of Isaiah, chapter 53. And he's talking about himself being numbered as one of the transgressors, numbered as one of the bad guys, if you like. What does Numbers verse 53, verse 12 also say about this person who's numbered amongst the bad guys, amongst the transgressors? It says he would die for us. What does Jesus say in Mark 10, verse 45? For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Isn't that a beautiful dovetailing? Jesus is linking his words with the words of the Old Testament, showing that he's a fulfillment of prophecy. And we know from our textual criticism studies, our copying fidelity studies, that we've got his words accurately. We know that we've got the book of Isaiah copied accurately. It seems that we can trust very truly what Jesus said, what we read in the books, in the Bible, is what Jesus really said. And of course, it's a profound implication that Jesus died for us all as a ransom for many. And that's where I'd like to